So
They didn't give us a whole lot of insights about bugs.
All right, we're going to get started here. I'm here today to talk about automated testing in Drupal 8, specifically with an angle towards testing sites that you're actually building, so all your custom code and configurations. My name is Jonathan Hedstrom. I'm a longtime Drupal developer, core contributor. I maintain the Drupal Behat extension and a bunch of other things. J Hedstrom almost everywhere except on Twitter. So we're going to go over why would you want to test, what's the point of it, what should you test, the types of tests available to you. Drupal 8, unlike Drupal 7, has a slew of available frameworks to use, and they all have very specific use cases. Is that loud enough? Now?
Just a little quiet, that's all.
Okay. We'll go through examples, and then we'll go through some details about various edge cases and things that you might run into, and then we'll go through some code examples. I'm not going to do a deep dive on any of these because each one could easily fill an hour, each type of test, or more. But there are a lot of resources out there once you have a general overview of what's available to you to do deeper dives and get this stuff working. So why would you want to test your custom code? Drupal has tons of test coverage. All the tests are always passing on Drupal 8. But that doesn't mean your site doesn't have bugs, right? And you might upgrade core and break something, even though core has a bunch of tests that are passing. So this guy was literally a rocket scientist, and this is one of my favorite quotes about testing. So one of the biggest things you can do with automated tests is if you have a known set of functionality and everything's passing and you change something and a test breaks, you're not going to accidentally discover that when you deploy to production on a Friday. Testable code is generally better code than untestable code. If you're trying to write tests and you're discovering your code, you can't write tests for it, chances are the code could be improved. And this is in particular in Drupal 8 with the adoption of object-oriented coding. Properly testable code is generally isolated, and it does one thing specifically instead of these long linear procedural functions from the Drupal 7 days. If you need to change something and you have good test coverage, you can confidently know that even if you're completely changing how it works on the underlying level, you know that at the end of the day, at least all the things that are tested that have automated tests are covered. I have an example from a contrib module where I needed to refactor the entire sending of email to use a batch process, which was non-trivial changes to code, but because the module had automated tests that covered when this happens, do these people get emails, do they not, whatever, I was able to do the refactoring with very minimal manual testing, which you should still manual test, you need manual testing, but it's nice to be able to do huge, drastic, sweeping changes and improve things without, and know you're not going to break things. I already mentioned deploying. All those above things sort of lead to being able to deploy your code with confidence. And a lot of people argue that they don't write tests because they don't have time for tests. And that will probably always be the case if the mentality is tests are something that you do if you have time. But if you adopt a process that requires tests over time, you actually increase velocity because of all those things above there. You're not having to go back and fix a regression that you introduced 2 months ago. You find it right away. And as you're developing, even if you have a test, for instance, that submits a form, logs in as 5 different users, if you're having to do that manually every time you change something, that's really slow. But if you have a test, you can run, you make tweaks to your code, run it again, it passes. You've probably saved yourself a lot of frustration and time too. Now, this last one is more about contributing back to core rather than something that you would do specifically on your project. But if you're trying to get a bug fixed or a new feature in Drupal core, you, for 99.99% of everything need a test to either demonstrate that the bug you're trying to fix is actually a bug, or that the feature you're trying to introduce is functional. So now, what do you test on a custom project, or just in general if you're writing a module? I mentioned logging in as a bunch of different users. So things like access control. You might have a matrix of 20 different roles and 400 permissions. Like, manually testing all of that would be infuriating and actually impossible to completely test that. Whereas with automation, you can loop through things. You can quickly log in as different users, create different content of different types. Workflows, which is related to access control. You might have, a workflow with 20 different states and different permissions associated with each of those states. And again, trying to manually do that every time you change something, you're going to introduce bugs if you don't have some sort of automation around that. Manually testing emails is, especially locally, really frustrating. Whereas if you can automate, if I do something, then these different roles should get an email. Automating that is really, really powerful and time-saving. If you've got a big, huge form with 20 required fields and you have to do something when that's submitted, manually filling that out can get very, very tedious. If you're integrating with external APIs, being able to not actually have to do a live call out to Salesforce or whatever. If you can mock, your assumptions that you expect their API to be functional, so when you send out a request, you expect to get something back. That's really nice, instead of having to sort of, create a sandbox account on whatever the API is and sort of do the full loop. So now, if you're fixing a bug, or you have a bug and you're in the habit of writing tests, the first thing to do is to write a test that reproduces the bug, and that's usually pretty easy. If you have a bug ticket and it says, when I log in as a user with this role and click on this button, I see this error. So you can write a test that says, log in as this user with this role, click on this button. You write it, you run it, you see the error, hopefully. That's why you ensure the test fails. If you write it and it passes, then maybe it's not a bug, or maybe your test is wrong, or maybe there's a nuance to the bug that you haven't caught. And then you dive into the code and see where the fix is. You fix the code and you run the test and it's green. And if you have, as you start adding these things up, you're not going to have to fix that bug ever again, because you have a test that ensures, as long as the tests are being run, you have a test that ensures that bug is no longer. Now, again, with new features, you might not have steps to reproduce, so this can be a little bit more flexible if the feature is well defined. You have sort of the boundary conditions of what defines the feature, and you write your test around that. Don't just test the happy path. In that example I mentioned where I was moving emails to the batch system, which runs behind the scenes long after the emails would have originally been sent dynamically, things can happen in between when a notification gets created and then it goes to send it. Like, a comment could be deleted. So don't assume that the comment you're trying to load is always going to exist. Or, don't assume that the user hasn't been deleted or blocked, or any number of things. And the more of those sort of edge cases you can, don't go out of your way to create ridiculous edge cases, but don't always assume that your linear progression through your code is the only way that code will be executed. I already mentioned mocking API return values, and I mentioned logging as many different user roles. That's a huge time saver. Form submissions, email verifications, anything that you don't like doing as a developer, or anything that you don't think manual QA can completely encompass. So I'm going to dive in now to the actual types of tests that Drupal 8 introduced. Most of these are do ship with actual Drupal core, and then there's a few others that are not part of Drupal core itself, but are available for testing Drupal sites. So I like to think of this as sort of a pyramid, and I don't have a fancy picture of a pyramid, but I'm starting at the bottom, and in an ideal world, you would have sort of the most coverage at the bottom. Unit test is at the bottom because they're fast, and they're really fast. And that's, and again, as I said, if you have unit testable code, you probably have really good code. And then as we go through these types, they get more complicated, but more powerful, but also slower. So you sort of want a nice stable base of as much sort of code coverage as possible with your unit tests, and then we'll go up the pyramid. So a unit test, in terms of Drupal, you have no database. You can have dependencies on other modules in terms of the classes they provide and things like that, but you don't, you're not going to have any database tables. You can't call, you can't save an entity. It's just, if you have and I'm going to do code examples later, so if this doesn't make sense, hopefully in the code examples it will. But in a very simple example, if you depend on, say the logger, and you want to log an error message, you can't just grab the Drupal logger service and execute it in your unit test, because it won't have, Drupal isn't bootstrapped. What you do instead is you say, here's my service that I'm testing depends on this logger, and I'm going to mock that logger. And I have examples of that too, and there's a framework called Prophecy that ships with PHP unit. Then down there at the bottom, unit test case, that's the core test class that all your tests would extend. And that, if you're familiar with PHP unit, that all of these tests that I'm going to go over are PHP unit based. There's a legacy system in core called Simple Test that is being rapidly removed at this point. One step above kernel tests, and in terms of power and access to Drupal things, it's very different than unit tests, but they're still very fast. They're nowhere near as fast as unit tests, but at this point you have access to a database and modules that you've told it you need. It won't actually install the dependencies of modules, so you in your test have to tell it, I know I need this module, but I might not need the aggregator module. Even if your module in totality depends on that module, your test, if it doesn't need it, you don't need to install it. It only installs the entity types you tell it to. So even if you say install the node module, it won't actually instantiate the node as an entity. You have to tell it, I'm going to use the node entity or the user entity. And the reason for that is they're meant to be really fast. So if your test isn't dealing with node, but you need like an API function from node, you can tell it to install the node module, but don't instantiate the node entity. And the same goes with database tables that are created by the module or hook schema and configuration. If you don't need the configuration files that ship with Node, then you don't need to install it. But if you do need them and don't install them, your test will fail. But it's pretty obvious why they fail. It'll say something like this configuration doesn't exist or this entity type doesn't exist. And again, there at the bottom, that's the core base class you extend for kernel tests. Functional tests are essentially all we had in Drupal 7. That's what simple test was. It does a full install of the modules you tell it to, including dependencies. So you don't have to manually list out all your dependencies to install. You just say, install this module I'm trying to test. You can do HTTP requests. You can say, go to node 123 and click edit. You can actually interact with the browser with clicks, and you can say, I expect, I should see this text in the browser, I should not see that button, etc. And then there at the bottom is the base class. JavaScript tests are identical to the ones I just mentioned, but they actually execute JavaScript in the front end. So if you have some Ajax that you're trying to test, this would be the test suite to use, because it unlike the other one, which is just sort of downloading the DOM and parsing it as XML, this actually I have an asterisk next to WebDriver because up until this morning I used Phantom.js for this, but 8.5 now uses WebDriver to drive an actual browser. So
Does it work better?
that's why they committed it. I haven't used it yet, but all of the core tests are passing. So
I've been using WebDriver for functional testing, but not within Behat.
So yeah, it. So again, as I mentioned before, in this base, this is up through now. This is probably the slowest, and actually of all the test types I'm going to talk about, this is the slowest one, because for each of these tests, if you have a test and you say you have 3 test methods in it, it actually does a site install for each of those test methods, and then driving a browser is much slower than just doing essentially a wget or a curl, grabbing the DOM and parsing it as XML. So if you had an inverted pyramid and you had a bunch of functional JavaScript tests and not very many of the others, your test suite would take a long time to run. So for this and the functional one, only use this if you're actually testing some custom JavaScript. Don't use it just because you want to make sure JavaScript's working. Because have one test that tests the JavaScript, and then if you're testing a form and you have one test testing JavaScript on that form, all your other tests don't have to retest that same JavaScript. So Behat, this does not ship with core. Drupal core doesn't use this. The advantage of Behat is you can test an entire site. All of the tests up through now, you're testing a subset of your project. You're not testing any configuration, so like roles that you create through the UI for your project, even node types. I mean, there's sort of ways to fake that back in if you have your custom module actually ship with a config file that defines your node type. But if somebody's not actually manually keeping those in sync, your site can quickly sort of become out of date with that original config that you might be testing. Behat, on the other hand, instead of doing a complete site install for every test, you point Behat at your test server where you have your site already installed. So you load a database from production, sanitize it, whatever, and then you run your Behat suite against that site. And so compared to the functional tests for test, they're really fast because it doesn't have to do a site install every test. The tools available for Behat try to clean up after themselves too. So you might have a test that logs in as a user of a given role. At the end of that test, it deletes that user. So you never want to run these against production anyway, but it sort of cleans up after itself. So you're not going to start having one test impact, or if a test left some data over and this next test comes in, it might fail if it wasn't cleaning up after itself like that. Anything theme specific is really good to test with this. If you've got like a pile of 30 node types and 40 user roles and 20 different workflows, you're going to want to use Behat to test that, because trying to sort of stand that stuff up in a functional test is just you'll never actually be testing what you think you're testing, even if you could figure out how to install all those things. And the timing of those tests, again, because they're doing a complete teardown and setup for every test, it would be very slow. So now there's 2 other types that I mentioned here that they're not quite tests, but they're really good for code quality. Exceptions, if you get something you don't expect, throw an exception. And inline asserts are used they're similar to exceptions, but they don't run on production. Because you generally configure PHP to not check them, so they don't hinder performance. And I have examples of this too. So any sort of implicit assumptions that you can't do through type hinting or whatever, you can use these sort of asserts. So I have an asterisk there because they're not quite a test suite, but they contribute towards good code and then this one, there is a core issue to allow those functional JavaScript tests to be run against an existing site. So at that point, Behat and those types would be functionally equal in terms of a developer writing tests. And The reason I put this here is Behat is traditionally supposed to be used for something called behavior-driven development, and I'm advocating for it to be used here not for behavior-driven development, but rather to test a site, because there's no other way to do it right now. So if this went in, then in theory, I mean, you can still use Behat, I don't care. But the founder of Behat is very, very adamant that it should only be used for BDD. But this would allow developers to write those sort of functional JavaScript tests against their complete configured site, and their performance issues would go away because, again, it wouldn't be doing that site install for every test.
Can I ask a quick question there?
Yeah.
I missed what you said. This core issue doesn't have to do with Behat.
No.
Okay.
But it would allow what I'm saying you should use Behat for now to be used without, you could use only the core test frameworks. And some developers would prefer to just write the syntax of these functional tests rather than having to, because Behat's an abstraction layer where so they're very readable tests and those map to the complex code underneath. If you're a developer and nobody but you is reading your features, at that point you could just write the PHP code. Behat is meant for every stakeholder from the developer all the way up to the product owner to be able to agree on a feature set and then have that actually map to some automation that demonstrates that the feature is working.
Okay.
I have an asterisk next to the theme-specific tests here because it is actually possible to write kernel and functional tests against themes if you tell it to use your theme before the test. Or in the case of the kernel tests, if you sort of manually load your twig or do your rendering yourself. But it's not recommended unless your theme has a lot of really heavy logic in it, which ideally it doesn't. So here's an example of what I was talking about in a search. So that first line there, if you have, say, a node, a function that's dealing with nodes, and you wrote it only to use, these two node types, you put that assert in there, and then 6 months down the line, somebody sees your function. They're like, oh, I should use that for my third node type. They'll get an error when they try to pass in, article or a page node. It'll just, it'll show up right there, and they'll know immediately that your function isn't expecting anything but those two node types. And again, exceptions, you can throw them. Drupal throws a lot of exceptions, Drupal 8, but doesn't catch very many, so be careful with wantonly throwing exceptions. But it's very clear to a developer anyway that something horrible has gone wrong when they see that. If it happens on production, it's usually a white screen and then less clear what's happening. So with all these test types, I'm going to go through sort of the conditions when you might switch from one to another. So again, starting with PHP unit, because you want that nice big base of test coverage. If you find yourself having to mock too many dependencies, that's, if you're mocking 2, 3, 4 dependencies, if you find yourself mocking 20, maybe it's time for a kernel test. Because with a kernel test, you have access to all those services. Drupal will instantiate them for you. Now, once we get to kernel tests, if you find yourself having to install, 24 modules and manually declare I need these 15 entity types, and that's an exaggeration. I'd say it's more like if you're installing more than 3 or 4 modules. But it depends. Again, because they are so fast, even if you are installing quite a lot of stuff, it might still be better than a functional test. But at some point, you might step back and look at it and say, yeah, I can remove this much code if I just switch to a functional test to test this. Now functional tests, once you're there and you're having to install again too many modules because you're trying to test your whole site or some really complicated part of your site, maybe it's time for Behat. And the same with configuration. If you're writing your test and actually going to your site's config directory and grabbing a view and a user role, maybe just switch to Behat so you don't have to do that setup. So here's a question. If you have this feature requirement on the right, who wants to take a guess at maybe what the best test type for that would be?
Yeah. Kernel.
I'm gonna go with Behat because these, as soon as you're dealing with a content and entity form, you're dealing with the display mode configuration, which is dependent on, or potentially dependent on, every module you have installed on your site, because, or at least a lot of them, because every field might be from a different module. And something like a field label is probably not going to be sitting in your module code. It's going to be in a site config file that even if you had your module initially install sort of the display mode for the user registration form, if somebody goes through the UI and edits it, it's not going to update the copy of that sitting in your test. So at that point your test is still passing, but they could have broken this feature. And they want the phone number field optional. And again, content types and field storage are very site specific, so, and potentially dependent on a large number of things. So now I'm going to go through some, it's essentially just some, well, it's not random, it's mostly about getting started. To run tests, Drupal core has a script that wraps PHP unit for a variety of reasons, but for me, running tests locally and even on projects where they're being run in a CI environment, I like using the PHP unit runner directly because it has better output. If you have a large number of tests, run tests is still valuable because you can run tests in parallel. And PHP unit won't do that itself. There's ways to do it yourself where you say, okay, I'm going to run 4 processes and the first one gets this chunk of tests, that chunk, whereas the run test script does all that for you. In practice, the command will look more like that, especially if you're developing locally and you don't want to run your entire test suite, you just want to run the test you're working on. That last parameter there, you can filter it down to a specific class or class and method name. You can point it at a specific directory, on your CI environment, you would probably just cut it off right there and run all of the tests in your custom modules. You can simplify that really long thing by adding a custom PHP unit.xml to the root of your file, and then you can store that or configure that complexity in there. You can even tell it which directory to run the tests in. So then at that point, your test your runner could be as simple as just running the binary. There's a couple environment variables. You can literally have those be environment variables, or you can set them in your PHP unit.xml. It's often best to have them coded into PHP unit.xml as the value that people will be using locally, and then have your CI environment use environment variables for its sort of specific needs, instead of the other way around where developers have to go out of their way to figure out how to run the tests. And while I'm on that, this is sort of an aside, but if you have a lot of tests and you're more than just one person working on a project, it's very important that you have some sort of automated way of running these, because if you don't, what will happen, even if the expectation is that every developer is supposed to run the test suite before they merge, at some point you'll have a broken test and nobody will notice it until they run the tests, and there's nothing worse than a lot of tests that are broken, because then nobody's code is the reason for the breakage. It's just they were already broken, so it's not my new code breaking them. With PHP unit, you can do code coverage reports. I don't recommend doing this locally because it takes a very long time, because it has to parse through all of the core code, even if you don't want your report to cover it. And you can tell it to not cover it, but it still is sort of, has to internalize all that and then generate reports. But if you have an automation server, you could run this, weekly or just manually on that server, just to get an idea of sort of, how much of our custom code is tested. I'm going to quickly get into more detailed code examples here, but this is just sort of an aside because you can even test things like exceptions, and it's good to test exceptions. Like if you have logic in your custom code that should throw an exception under specific circumstances, you can write a test for it. And the way you do that is you tell PHP unit, if this test doesn't throw this exception, then it fails. And so, you tell it, I'm expecting this exception, and then you do the thing that should trigger that. And if it doesn't throw that exception, then that's a failing test. When you're writing tests, you want to leverage as much reusable code as you can. And one way that core does that is with something called traits. So because there's these different test types, you don't want to have the method that creates a node recopied into every test class. So there's core ships with a bunch of traits. One is called node creation. It lets you quickly create a node. User creation. There's a bunch of them. So if your custom code, if you want to have, say you have 3 custom modules and you're going to use a piece of functionality in all of them, put that in a trait and then just include that in your tests. Similarly, base classes, if it's never going to change, then those 3 tests can just always extend the base class that does the heavy lifting for the setup. And data providers that's a way to tell PHP unit, here's a function that's going to give you an array of different combinations of things to test, and then you pass those as arguments to your actual test method. These should only be used for unit and kernel tests because, as I mentioned, functional and JavaScript functional, they do a new setup for every function, and if you had a data provider sending it 20 arguments, it would do setup and tear down 20 times for that one test method. But because unit and kernel tests are so fast, you can use data providers. Here's an example of a data provider testing access. It's very trivial, but you can imagine this being a lot more complicated. So I've got my test method here with these arguments. Should they get access? Here's the permissions they have. Are they an admin? And then over here on the right, the first one, no, they shouldn't have access. So expected access is false. They have no permissions and they're not an admin. Admin access, they should get access. They have no permissions, but they're an admin. And then normal access, they're not an admin. They should get access because they have that permission. And this doesn't have the details of the test, but you would actually then just take these things and assert equals my access method and pass it those permissions or create a user. And for all of these test types, some of the best examples are in core. They're not always the best though, because there's a lot of tests in core and some were just sort of ported from legacy tests. But so any sort of new test being written for a new module, an experimental module, for instance, is probably a good place to look. So content moderation, which just became stable, has a lot of good examples of all these different types of tests. I mentioned mocking dependencies for unit tests. You can actually mock dependencies for kernel tests too, and even functional tests if you want. An instance where you might mock a dependency for a functional test would be if you're testing an API integration and you don't want your test to actually call out to Salesforce or to whatever you're using. You could actually use this for a functional test, but for the most part, they're used almost exclusively by unit tests and occasionally kernel tests. What you essentially do is you tell PHP unit, this is the class I want to mock. It creates a copy of it. It lets you tell it sort of if they call the ID method, I'm going to return foo. And if they call the delete method, I'll do nothing because there's nothing to do. And if they call access, I'll return false. You sort of set up the expectations that this other, hopefully well-tested service will do as you are sort of telling this fake version of it to do. So here we're gonna make a fake version of the language manager, and you generally pass in interfaces rather than the exact class for a variety of reasons. One of the best reasons though is if you pass in the exact class and it passes, and then you pass in the interface and it doesn't, it means your code is dependent not on the interface that you're trying to mock, but an actual specific version of that class. These two lines of code are actually doing the same thing. I prefer the first version because if you have a typo in the first version, you'll get a fatal error. If you have a typo in the second version, it'll mock. I think it'll just return null. It won't give you any feedback, and you'll have really weird behavior that you have to debug. This works anywhere where you're using class names. I just like to point that out. I think in PHP 5.5 and beyond or somewhere. So now after here we have our mock service, and we're going to say when I call is multilingual on that, I want that to return true. If you did nothing here, by default, all methods on that thing would return null. And when I call get language name with en, it will return English. Once you've done these things, if these methods aren't called, your test will fail. So it's a way of also sort of, you know, testing what's going on, for instance, in protected methods or something. Once you've sort of done all that setup of all the methods you expect to be used, you call reveal on the object, and now this service variable is functionally, or as far as PHP is concerned, it's identical to the actual language manager.
The slide before this, when you can you test protected methods? Will this expose protected as public just by doing this, or do you have to?
No.
Okay.
No. There's ways to do that, but I don't recommend it. You know, you can use, what's it called?
The reflection.
Reflection, yeah. If you find yourself doing that, it's often better to have your test, instead of testing that service, extend the service you're trying to test, and then you can add methods to that to access those protected methods.
I see. Okay.
So then, once you have this service, and say the service you're trying to test requires this as, you know, a constructor argument, you can take that and pass it in. You know, say the thing I'm going to test equals new my service, and give it this argument, and then you can just start calling methods on your test method. So, like I mentioned, the best examples out there are probably in core and the better contrib modules. Writing tests for core issues can be a really good way to learn. You can find those by searching for things that are tagged needs tests. And if there's a module you know really well in terms of functionality, and it's a good module that has tests, just go in and look at how are they testing things. All right. I'll switch over to some code examples. I'll start with a unit test. All right.
Nice.
So this is a unit test for a custom entity type in a contrib module called content moderation notifications. And like you see here, we're extending that core test class. And here I'm just setting a bunch of data that I'm going to create this fake version of an entity with. And you'll see why we're doing that in a second. So in my setup method, I'm creating a new instance of this custom entity type, and I'm passing in that data up here. And now I just want to test all these custom all these methods on this entity type to make sure they're working. So when when I call send to author, I expect it to be true because I set true up here. So this is very simplistic. In theory, it shouldn't need a test because it's so simple, but in practice, typos exist, and so it's literally just going through every method on this custom entity type and making sure that it's behaving as expected. And since unit tests run fast, I will show you how fast it runs. And just ran all those tests. I'll show you one with with prophecy, where we're actually mocking some things. Actually, no, there it was. That's the wrong one. I'll do that after I go through these other test types, because I found some good examples before, but forgot to get one of. Oh wait, there's a prophecy right there. Sweet. So up until this point, we were testing very simple methods. Now here on this method, we need more than just the custom class and itself. You know, it has some dependencies on, in this case, the entity manager interface, and that's because it's extending a core class that has all these things as dependencies. You know, we're just going, and honestly, the way that these get written, or for me anyway, is I just start running the test until I hit a, you know, this dependency doesn't exist, and then I mock it. I don't know ahead of time necessarily all the different dependencies, especially when you get into the entity system. That can be a big hole. But you know, when entity manager calls get definition with our custom entity type, it's going to return. So you can chain these things together. So you see here, it's returning the mocked entity type. The entity manager is returning this. And then we actually tell the container when we look for this service, return this mocked one. By default on a unit test, the container is empty. So the error you would get here that would make you know you have to mock the entity manager is the test would fail with something like undefined service entity.manager. And again, you know, it's just, this is actually even mocking some queries, which I don't recommend necessarily doing, but it's not actually mocking any database queries. It's just mocking certain behaviors of that class. It doesn't go so far as to actually try and mock a database connection. Next up, kernel tests. Kernel tests are the ones where you have to you have access to all of the Drupal API, but you have to tell it which parts you want. And I'm actually going to go to the base class here because I think that's where the heavy lifting happens. Here's an example of a trait usage. So we know we're going to create users during this, so we include that. So here's a complete list of modules, even though if you were to just install this, or if this was a functional test, you would just have to install this one module because all those others are dependencies at some point. But because this is a kernel test, we have to tell it exactly which ones we want. This is the manual schema installation. This creates a node access table. And then we're going to use users, content moderation states, and workflow participants, and we want the configuration from these 4 modules installed. And that's the base class, and this function here just does some additional setup to get a workflow added to the entity type passed in. So now here's our actual test that extended that setup. It does some setup of its own. It knows it's going to use nodes. System table, we need the sequences table as soon as you have to create users for some reason. And then we're just sort of creating some data setup. So this module it's called workflow participants, and it sits on top of core's content moderation to let you specify individuals that don't have global permissions to be either an editor or a reviewer of a given piece of content. If you can imagine having to manually test that repeatedly, you have to first, create some users that have this one role. You've got to create a user that can add these users. You've got to, there's a lot of stuff going on, and you might forget something at some point. So being able to automate that just saves so much time. Like you can see up here in the setup function, we've already created 5 users. And here we want to have these users be editors on the node, and we want to have this person be a reviewer. And then we would expect that when we call, and this is further complicated by its testing email that these people get. So it's sort of the pinnacle of not wanting to manually test this. So
How does it actually do that? Do you walk out an SFTP thing?
no, it's great. There's a trait called assert mail trait. And in a functional test, these things are already there. So in functional tests, you don't have to tell it, I want to use these, they're just there. But in kernel tests, you have to tell it, I'm going to be testing email. And what this actually does is it replaces the mail handler with something that's just stored in the state table. So every time an email goes out, it just stores it as an array in the state table. And it also has these methods that let you assert, I think the body should be equal to this, or the subject should be equal to that, or the recipient should be equal to whatever. So after we've created all these users, added them as participants to the node in question, when we call our notifier service, we expect that it's going to be. Wait, I'm on the wrong test. Here. Oh, right. If there's no participants, we shouldn't be sending email. That's what this first one is doing here. Then we add some participants to the node, and we expect that these 3 people would be flagged by our service as needing an email. And, since the test passes, we know they are. And then here at the bottom, I think we're ensuring that they don't get emailed repeatedly if somebody adds a new participant to that node. So now we'll look at a functional test for the same module. This is the to test that the administrative UI, and it's not just the administrative UI. It's like the UI for all these different roles. So
Which module is it?
this is called workflow participants. The configuration one's not that exciting. So here's one that tests this as a author to ensure that they can in fact add participants if they have the permission to do so. So here we're creating a user. We're giving the user these 3 permissions. And what happens behind the scenes is the test framework actually creates a role with only these 3 permissions, creates a user with that role, and returns it. This sort of illustrates how you wouldn't want to do this for your custom role that might have 32 permissions with it, because you'd have to code those in here, which that can quickly get out of date, or go and magically grab that role definition from the site's config. But in this case, we know the module, at least for this level of testing, will work fine if the role only has these 3 permissions. We actually log the user in. This actually does a form post with the user's credentials and logs them into the site. So here, since they only have manage own workflow participants, they can't, they get a 403 if they try to manage somebody else's. And then we verify that when they create their own node, they actually can't. They get a 200 when they try to manage workflow participants. Here we're testing that somebody added as an editor can indeed edit the node. So we log in the editor, we get the node. Well, first we set them as an editor up here. But then, these things here, this Drupal get, that's actually the HTTP request I was talking about. There's a similar one, Drupal post form, where you give it an array of things that change. So here we're checking that editors can actually manage participants themselves. So if I'm an editor, I can add other editors, whereas a reviewer could not because they're a reviewer. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but that's sort of, and the JavaScript functional tests look identical to this, except JavaScript is executed and you have access to a few additional methods to actually execute JavaScript against the loaded page. I'm going to open a Behat file. This is what a Behat test looks like. So it's very different than the others. And so as a developer, there's code on the back end. And this first step, for instance, is a custom step definition, whereas the other four ship with a framework called the Drupal Behat extension. But you can see it's actually the second one that's the custom. Like, it's doing a lot in that one that one thing. It's creating a user. It's adding them as a reviewer to a node that it's creating, all as part of the test. And at the end of the test, that user goes away, that node gets deleted, and then it just verifies some assumptions. When I should see that unpublished thing when I'm on my workflow view. And that's all I got.
I'm curious about the Behat. You said one of those is a custom. So there's something going on in the background that's parsing that second line and turning it into PHP, right? And that's what you have to extend if you have custom situations and you're trying to Behat test them?
Yeah, let me show you what, not that one, because that one I don't have the code for, but I can show you what these things look like.
And I guess best practices on that, would you, if you're working on a Drupal site, would you create one custom module that just extends the Behat module for all of that? Or would you have those to each individual custom module?
These aren't actually modules. They're Behat sits almost completely outside of Drupal, and you tell it where to find the code, what the URL it should be hitting is, a few other things, but those are the big ones. It's like, where is the actual Drupal code on the system, and what's the URL I do when I'm actually trying to load pages. So here's an example of a step that all it does is make sure the person's not logged in. So in the feature file, you would say, given I'm not logged in, or given I'm an anonymous user. On the back end, this is the code that gets called, and it logs them out.
And that file that you're looking at right there, Drupal context,
Yeah.
that's outside a web root. That's just sitting up somewhere along Behat, or
Yeah. So the way it's best practice with Drupal 8 to not have the web root be your repo root. You want that
one level up.
one level up. Call it web, call it build, whatever. And then in your root, you have in our projects at phase 2, we do test / and all the Behat stuff lives under there. Behat as a project lives in the vendor directory along with all your other dev dependencies. With Drupal 7, you could install it completely separate because Drupal 7 didn't use Symfony stuff. With Drupal 8, you have to install them together, or you start getting these weird version mismatches of Symfony components and other dependencies. It's the same way you have to do that with Drush now. Here's a more complicated one. Given I'm logged in as a user, or given I'm logged in as an administrator. Administrator would be passed in here as role. We make sure they're not already logged in with that role. If they're not, we create a new user. This user create, I'll show you really quick, actually tracks here. It's tracking that it's adding a user, so then on teardown that gets called and that user will be removed. We create a role and add it to that user, and then we log the user in. Like I said, all of these test types could benefit from a whole hour or more on each of them. There's a lot out there on Behat.
So the Behat Drupal module isn't actually a module that installs in your site. It's an extension or something to the Behat framework.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
so you could, something like that. This is just Drupal core. It's not an actual project, so you wouldn't typically install it there, but on your project, however, or you just edit your composer.json and add it as a dev dependency.
So if you're developing a custom module and you want to do some Behat tests for that module, would you drop your feature or your context, your Behat context class, implementing your feature steps into like your modules?
You could.
Test directory, test bootstrap.
If you're just talking a custom module, It's probably those first 4 types of tests for the most part. If it's a feature module that is more, like I'm talking about like the features module itself. If it's one of those, then maybe. But there's nothing automated right now. I was just talking to Ryan about actually getting that support on Drupal.org. But I was thinking more for install profiles rather than modules, because install profiles actually do use this heavily. The Lightning distribution and a few others. I think Drupal Commerce might use it too. But again, a profile is more like I want all of the config available. I don't just want to test this subset. But a custom module, you can usually be pretty confident that it's working at least as anticipated using those first 4 test types, like the unit test, the kernel test, and the functional JavaScript. Yeah.
So if I needed to mock a bunch of data, let's say I needed like these 10 users, these 10 user roles, these 10 nodes, like to run my test, is there a good system for doing something like that? Like a lot of other frameworks will have a way to put them into a JSON file or PHP file or something like that, where we'll just load them up when it bootstraps the test.
So for the first 4 types, you can just loop through and create 10 users. In the functional JavaScript or kernel, you could create those. But are you talking specific?
Let's say I needed to create, 10 user roles and 1 user within each role, and then they were supposed to look at, like, based on permissions, whether they could see certain nodes and they shouldn't be able to see other nodes, for example.
So again, for the first 4 types, there's nothing like a JSON file. I mean, someone could probably write a plugin that did do that. For Behat, there's something called example scenarios, where it will run your scenario for every row in your example. So you could say, it's sort of like a table. Like, so you'd have your 10 users and then their roles, and it would iterate through those rows and run your scenario for each of them.
Okay.
And then like an expected outcome would presumably be the 3rd column in that.
So like an example scenario that we ran into when trying to do Behat with Drupal 7 was, we had to have, like I said, different types of user permissions, different users in those permissions. And we probably, either some of the stuff wasn't available or we didn't know how to use it, but we basically had it automating a browser to create a user, log in as that user, do something, log out, log in as the admin, create another user, log in as them, do something, and the test took like 15 minutes to run.
Yeah, that's as an aside, if you are writing Behat things, try and minimize, if you're not testing that user form itself, have one test to test the user form through the UI, and for all your other tests, use the API like this is doing right here. When this is called, it's actually directly using Drupal to create that user. It's not using the UI. The thing in Behat that would basically do that for you, I think, is called.
There's a format for encoding data in a table, and there's some steps that let you add in.
It's different than a background. It actually would run the background. It's scenario outline.
That's what some other frameworks call it. But, I didn't want to confuse that with, logging the dependencies. So.
But if you research scenario outline, that is the thing that would basically let you give it 10 users, and each user could have a different set of permissions, and it would loop through those and run the scenario for each of them.
Okay.
Behat's documentation has sort of become scattered, so it can be a little hard to find.
So those traits in the kernel test were pretty awesome. Can you use those in Behat for custom stuff?
You probably can't use. Well, you could try. I mean, like the Drupal extension itself doesn't, because it's a framework that actually works with Drush. For instance, if you're not running Behat on the same server that you're testing, then you can use Drush to actually create those users remotely. So the Drupal extension itself wouldn't use those traits because A, it would make it Drupal 8 specific, and B, it would require that you run it locally, meaning running Behat on the same server. In practice, I almost always recommend, if you can, run Behat on the same server, because then you have in your custom context the full power of Drupal. You don't have to go and open a pull request to the Drupal driver, which is the thing that handles that abstraction, to do
Do
your...
it all locally in Jenkins as well.
Yeah,
So-
yeah. If you can run it on the same server, and again, you shouldn't be running this stuff against production anyway, so you don't ever have to deploy it to production. It's always faster to just assume Drupal's there, then you can call all the Drupal API methods because Drupal gets bootstrapped, and then you can just call /Drupal : service. Give me this service, give me that service. Create a role, create a user. In your case, you could loop through your 10 users and create them right there in that step definition. So in that case, when you are knowing that A, you're running against Drupal 8, and B, it's going to be on the same code, you could try and add that trait and see what happens. I just forget behind the scenes what's happening with those traits and whether they make assumptions about being used only in those PHP unit-based classes or not. In theory, it should work, because I think in theory all it's doing, you might have to set a container parameter on your context, because I think they're probably calling the container, but at that point, you probably could use them. But for the big heavy lifting things like creating nodes and users, the Drupal extension already has those too. So you probably couldn't use the mail trait, because, although again, you could try. I just don't know offhand what would happen.
Use the Chrome Mink driver or Chrome Behat extension,
The Chrome Behat extension. No.
or
what?
yeah, it runs the Behat commands directly through a Chrome instance or something like that, instead of having to go through Selenium or something.
I've used
How
the
do you know?
Chrome web driver, where you can actually see Chrome pop up, and that's the cool thing about Behat. If you run it with a non-headless web driver, you actually see it pop up and then drive through the UI really fast and
So
log users in.
You don't need to be running Selenium to use the WebDriver stuff. So if you've got your Behat configuration, if you have a file pointing to a Delta server that's running Chrome driver, then it should be able to just do the test with Chrome on that other system, headless or otherwise.
So I think we're at time. So thank you all for coming.